Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. This month, I'm thrilled to announce that we're going to be talking to Dr. Alexander Cummins, who is a contemporary cunning man and historian of magic. His magical specialities are the dead, or folk necromancy, divination, geomancy, the cunning-crafts of traditional British service magic, and the grimoires. His published works include The Black Raven with Brian Johnson, Nazarth, Pillars of Gladness, The Art of Cyprian's Mirror of Four Kings, An Excellent Booke of the Art of Magicke with Phil Legard, A Book of the Magi, The Starry Rubric, and a host of essays and collections by both occult and academic publishers. Al is a frequent speaker on the international circuit and co-hosts the podcast Radio Free Golgotha. Dr. Cummins' work, classes and services can be found at www.alexandercummins.com. And in this particular chat, we're going to be talking mostly about geomancy, which is that form of divination that I mentioned earlier. We are going to talk about how it works as a form of divination, how it can also be used for more magical operations, and just why more people need to use titles like service magician as a job title. So enjoy! Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Hello and welcome to Fabulous Folklore. How are you doing?
I'm grand. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to get to sit down and chat about some stuff.
I have a feeling this would be a lot more fun if we were sitting having a coffee somewhere.
Yeah, that is preferable, right?
But thanks to the wonders of Zoom, we can do this online. Obviously, I've asked you on to talk about geomancy, which I will full disclosure, up until about 2 years ago, I'd never really heard of before. I knew the name, but I wasn't quite sure what it involved. And
Yeah.
then the more I looked at it, I was like, this is a really, really interesting topic. Why is it not better known? So I thought I'd ask you on to talk about it because you clearly know how to do it properly and can explain it really well. But what is geomancy for people in the audience who've never heard of it?
All right. So the kind of TLDR is it's a divination system that becomes very popular in early modern Europe. As a divination system, it's a way of mapping things, right? Of generating information and analyzing it and producing this kind of synthesis of understanding, how the fates and fortunes are playing out for yourself or for a querent, as the term goes, or like a client. It's about gaining wisdom about what's going on. And you can frame that as like knowledge at a distance, those kinds of things, and understanding how patterns of things play out is especially big in geomancy. Specifically, geomancy as a divination system works by deriving and understanding the interplay of these 16 answers that get called the 16 figures. They are, to be mathsy about it, 4-bit binary figures. They are like the I Ching's hexagrams, which are like 6 broken or unbroken lines. But there's only 4 of them, right? And also, like the I Ching, it maps like elemental forces in those 4 lines interaction, the classic fire, air, water, earth. And so geomancy is the divination we do with these 16 figures. I think that's a good like broad way of putting it. It's sometimes described as a sortilege because you can cast geomancy, you can generate figures with any 2-sided object, with like coins or sticks, or even by reading odds and evens from any generated number. So you can do that by dice, or one of the very traditional ways is like kind of randomly marking the earth or a piece of paper with dots while praying or like calling in spirits or God or the wisdom of the earth, and then counting those dots up afterwards and doing that 4 times to generate like 4 sets of odd or even numbers that then gets translated into a figure.
I know it's quite funny because I decided I was going to have a go at this because obviously I did, and I actually made myself a little set of cards. So I've got like 1 dot on like half of them and 2 on the other, so that when I sort of shuffle them, I can literally lay them out as like the 4 figures.
Oh, I love that. That's great.
Just because laziness.
Yeah, it's very adaptable like that. You can be, yeah, like maths, right? We want to be lazy in terms of getting the most out of the least we do, right? I think that's a great rubric for sorcerers, right? And diviners sometimes as well.
So you mentioned obviously the links or the similarities rather with the I Ching there, but where does geomancy come from? Is it something that we can actually pinpoint and go, there it is? Or is it one of those things where it's quite amorphous and comes out of maybe several places.
No, we can be pretty accurate. And when I say geomancy, I'm mostly talking about the geomancy that becomes popular in like the European Renaissance and afterwards, 15th and 16th and 17th centuries. But originally, it's from Arabic and arguably well, not arguably, and also Persianate kind of practices, traditions that get called ramal or al-ramal, the science of sand or the practice of marking charts of these 16 figures originally in the sand. So as learned works of like Arabic mathematics as well as like occult philosophy are transmitted, it gets picked up in Europe both by scholars and like, occultists, but also like merchants and an awful lot of like service magicians, the kind of people we call cunning folk, divining down an alley near the marketplace and stuff like that. So we have some records of it cropping up in European stuff as early as the 11th century. And there's a famous example of Chaucer in the 14th century making a geomantic reference. He talks about the greater fortune of the sunrise, which is the greater fortune, Fortuna Major, is one of the 16 figures that's attributed to the sun often. And by the 16th century, we start to see an awful lot of geomantic handbooks not only being translated into English, but also selling really well to readers and practitioners who are eager to use it. And that trend kind of continues with the wider kind of occult explosion of texts, especially in like 17th century England and later. So it definitely has these origins in these Arabic and Islamic forms, but then gets like a lot more astrologized and kind of fitted to the kinds of things that European occultists, diviners, and sorcerers are interested in.
So would you say it's a little bit more of like an established system compared to other practices? So you know what the 16 figures are, you know that you're not going to get anything beyond that, but then it's how you interpret how they relate to each other and so on. Is that why it might be easier for people to pick it up because there's rules that they can follow?
Yeah, there really are. Yeah, you can start by like learning the 16 figures themselves, which are attributed to like the seven planets, the seven classical planets, as well as having like elemental affinities or they're put into these like elemental quartets, like the 12 signs of the zodiac are put into the elemental triplicities, and so you can cast. Figures and kind of read off those, but there are also more formal ways of doing geomantic charts that get called shields because they are generally shield shaped. And that gives you a lot more nuance. So from a figure that might have different connotations, different nuances. There are a few figures that are generally like not good news, but a lot of them are very much dependent on the kind of question you're asking and where they crop up in a chart. So one of the best examples, I guess, is like Amicio. Loss is a figure usually attributed to Venus, and loss can be the bad side of Venus, like breakups. Also rules a lot of like internalized shame, guilt, the emotions we're not proud of about ourselves. But it's also a great figure for, if you're asking whether to go on a diet, right? Or if this diet is working, or healing. It's great for the loss of a sickness. And so
Oh,
it very much depends on the context that the figure is answering. Like what to do about this thing as well as what is going on. And so, yeah, there are rules that you can learn to like set these 16 figures in configurations. And without going on too much of a long-winded tangent here, uh, one of the features of geomancy that is also especially useful about it is that you can chart the way that things will play out by examining how one pattern of consequences, influences, inertias represented by a figure interacts with another figure. So we do this all the time with all sorts of different divination systems, right? Like most cartomancers I know are like, yeah, you can talk about what the Queen of Wands means, but really it's about where it falls in a reading, right? Is it next to, what cards is it next to? Are there other ones cropping up? Is it reversed? Like that kind of stuff. With geomancy, you can literally add these figures together because they're four lines of single or double dots. And so you can add figures together to produce a third figure. So it is like inherently dialectical, if we want to frame it like that, that when this pattern of energy meets this pattern of energy, this third set of of consequences will always happen in some form. There are all sorts of examples of this. That's how you can also not just say what's going on, but where is this going and what should I do about it?
So this is going to be like the $10 million question, I suppose, but is it particularly accurate? And how does it actually work then if it is? I know that's a probably really horrible, like highbrow question, but that is the thing that immediately springs to mind.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's fair. I have found it pretty accurate. I have found that most of the time that I have either made predictions, I mean, it can do predictive stuff. It's also very good at looking at what's going on now and what you are trying to achieve and how to get there, right?
Mhm.
So it's not just a fatalist system of this will always or this will never happen. It describes the shape and the flavor of the way things play out. I've found that when I've made inaccurate predictions, it's almost always because I wasn't aware of the nuance of the answer I was getting. It was human error, right? I'll own that, especially when I was first getting started. Um, I think partly it comes down to the fact that it works off some very simple fundamental principles, the four elements, the seven planets, these 16 figures, but also how they play out in particular circumstances. So a shield chart, for instance, we can think of it like a 15 card spread, like a 3 card past, present, future. And the first 12 of those places into which we would slot or mark a figure are directly nabbed from the 12 houses of the heavens from traditional astrology. But what that means is that on the one hand, you can isolate a particular facet of life and say, okay, the client is interested in their love life. We can look to the seventh, right, is classic, as well as maybe the fifth for the fun times of that. We can also do that in a geomantic chart. So we can get granular about the particular things and not just do an overall like your love life will be good or it will be bad, right? We can talk about why it's good. There's qualitative as well as quantitative analysis. But that also means that each of the 16 figures has a particular way of speaking in each of the 12 houses, which means you go from learning 4 elements and 7 planets to 16 figures to 192 combinations of those figures in the houses. And so we start to get like very particular. And then we can also look at not just what that figure is saying in that house, but what another figure is saying in a house that might be also relevant. So it gives this way of being able to give quite like bird's eye overviews of what's going on, as well as getting into the weeds of like the specifics of how different facets in life and a situation are playing out, and also how they interrelate with each other.
Yeah. I think when you're saying that as well about obviously the different houses of astrology and so on. So
Yeah, yeah.
is astrology the one that it intersects with the best, do you think?
I would say so. Yeah, I think so. The European Renaissance geomancy I practice is, as I said, like very heavily astrologized. It's often called like a sister art to astrology or even terrestrial astrology. So, as I said,
Oh.
each of the 16 figures is attributed an alignment, I would say. I'm a little bit skeptical of calling them rulerships. They fuel the figures, the 7 classical planets. So, just as Mars rules like Aries and Scorpio in traditional astrology, Mars also fuels the 2 geomantic figures of Pua and Rubeus. Pua is the young warrior sometimes, or the boy, or even the child. Big childlike enthusiasm, bravado, but also the things that young men do. But it also rules Rubeus, the red or the bloodshed. And so you get both sides of Mars. The noble day side, Pua can be a figure of great like protection and reinvigoration and confidence. And Rubeus, like what happens after, what happens as the result of actual war, right? But also sometimes Rubeus, which is often like a red alert figure, suggesting that things have got too martial, have got too violent, either to other people or to ourselves. There's a lot of stuff in Rubeus about like um, self-destructive habits, things like problems with like substance misuse can come up there. But it's also a figure of surgery, like necessary surgery. Like it's the blood of the scalpel going in and removing your inflamed appendix before something worse happens. So there's always aspects we can find for ensuring that even a quote bad figure, a figure representing some of the destructive and negative and unhelpful parts of, say, Mars, is also, we can also find a place for it, even if that place is like, avoid this thing. There's also like zodiacal elemental triplicities comparisons, right? The 16 figures are arranged in these like elemental quartets as well. I would say, unlike astrology, geomancy isn't reliant on the movement of astronomical bodies. It takes like the schemas and meanings and mysteries of the stars and the planets and looks at their influence and instantiation, like here on Earth in the sublunary realm where all our stuff is, right? And it then tracks and analyzes them by the generation and interrelation of those 16 figures.
Yeah. Is it the kind of thing where when people then talk about, obviously there's obviously a lot to learn for that, but finding accuracy within that is sometimes it all down to what kind of question you ask to go with it.
Yes. Yeah, emphatically, I'd say. One thing I've found is that you can't. Your accuracy goes massively down if you try and do a questionless geomancy reading. If you just like, just throw some figures and see what they say, right? Because these figures have ranges of meaning in different contexts, that could be helpful or unhelpful, right? Like we talked about loss sounding bad, but being great for healing. Karka, a saturnine figure, the cell or isolation or literal prison sometimes is also the figure that cropped up for people I was reading for online during lockdown. Right,
Yeah.
it is a figure of quarantine. It's yes, it's isolating, but also it's the protection that means you don't, catch a deadly disease or, God forbid, pass it on to someone you love. Right. So again, it very much depends on the question you've asked, and so having a set question is, I think, really crucial. It can still be very broad to give context to the answers. My favorite phrasing of a query starts with what to bear in mind about X,
Mhm.
which can sound a little unwieldy, but this allows for both predictive stuff as patterns are currently playing out. What do I need to bear in mind about? As well as more investigative answers that might arise, like what can I do about this? Um, Ideally, we are looking to like secure the blessings that are predicted or that are like measured in a chart to avoid the maladies that we can avoid and to kind of weather the ones that we can't. And so geomancy sometimes has this reputation for being mostly or only about yes, no answers. And it can do that with a lot of nuanced techniques. Like there are particular techniques once you've set a chart for like how the figures relate and speak. But it's also really good at charting, as I say, how patterns play out, as well as what we can do to um, get behind the wheel of the current lay of the land rather than get hit by the car of it.
Yeah. It sounds to me like geomancy might have that thing baked into it where you do have to have an awareness of nuance. It can't just be looking for the good stuff. Because I know you sometimes get that with tarot where it's like, oh, I'm just going to ignore this particular card. Like if the tower comes up, I'll just go looking for the nice cards instead. And you're like, well, are there even any nice cards in tarot? And it sounds like geomancy has a similar thing going on where it actually, you just need to look at things possibly with a bit more of an open mind than just going yes, yes, no, good, bad.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think it's really important in terms of like just the sheer ethics of a diviner. Like if you go for blood tests from like a medical doctor and they're like, well, let's look at the positive side of things. And like, the death card means transformation, which it does, right? Obviously. But it's your job as a diviner to like impart the information that these spirits are bringing you. And I can't speak for other people, but the reason I work with these spirits of geomancy in my readings is because they're way smarter than me. And so my job is to accurately pass on the most accurate measurements and be able to furnish the client with the ways that they can step further into responsibility, sovereignty, and agency in their own lives, right? And I don't do that well if I sugarcoat stuff or if I cherry pick just the nice stuff, right? I also don't relish, doing the like, here are hard truths, here's tough love, right? But there's some halfway compromise between those, being able to balance like, here's stuff you might not like to hear, but is really useful for you, right? Um, and so yeah, I think geomancy has a lot of that stuff that can be that kind of certainly like older forms have a lot of stuff about this isn't just a yes no. Here's like why this particular case is currently a probably yes or a definitely no or so on. And there's also like historical reasons why people often frame it as a yes no thing.
Do you think there can be a danger with any form of divination that if you were to give someone a perfectly positive answer, maybe that was actually what came out, that they
Mm.
might then sort of rest on their laurels and not actually continue to put any more effort in because it's like, oh, this is a done deal, this is going to go well. Whereas if you're like, actually, you're going to have to do a little bit of work here, you've given
Yeah.
something. to do. So they've actually got some action that they can take where they're more likely to get something out of it.
Yeah, yeah, I think this is again about resisting the fatalism of any like divination practice, right? We talk a lot about like, or I don't know, I hear a lot of people talking a lot about the bad side of that when there's a bad reading and the client kind of shuts down and is like, well, there's nothing I can do about it. That's fatalism. But so too is like everything is perfect and nothing I could do could go wrong. Um, I will stop wearing my seatbelt and la 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 la, right? Uh, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for not just talking about what like blessings or good fortune is to come, but also how to secure those, how to
Mm.
maintain them, how to further cultivate them, how to like, continue to capitalize on them. And so not just, and again, for me, partly that comes down to not just asking like, will this thing happen, but also like what to bear in mind about ensuring it happens in terms of like how long it's going to take, how much effort it's going to be, whether it's going to be easier or harder at the beginning, what it is to maintain something, what it is to develop something. So yeah, I think that's a really astute observation. One of the things that you can also do with geomancy is look at not just the result, but also how the client is going to take that information as well. You can do that a couple ways. The first house, the first place of these 15 places of a shield chart marks the querent, which can talk a little bit about what it's chiefly like what they're going through at the moment in brief, right at the beginning, but it can also mark some particular things to bear in mind. If you get a missio, that figure of loss in the first house, it can often signify that the client has forgotten to tell you something important. This isn't always like deceitful. It can often be because they're a little bit ashamed of something. Had a student who was reading for someone, and it was about a job prospect for this client. And my student was like, I don't understand why this reading is coming up with all this stuff about like the police and possible imprisonment. And it wasn't until they kind of like asked directly, like, is there anything else going on, that the client was like, I'm not exactly legally documented in this country at the moment. And aside from, judgment about that, or, oh God, the right wing rattling sabers about immigrants coming over here taking our jobs, like that was something that the chart was flagging, that there was more information to be like asked from the querent. And there's also other ways that you can do that, looking at the interrelation of the figure that marks the querent and the final judgment, the distilled answer, the 15th place of the chart. You can add those two figures together and get a third figure, which will reflect how the client will take this. So that can show you, even though the reading is great, the client is going to squander this, or is not, or is going to get blasé, or rest on their laurels. Likewise, you can also see if a chart like has a bunch of bad news coming and you're like, hey, you need to do something about this. You're at a point where you get to decide if you're going to keep going and face like some uh, either some consequences or just some like bad luck. That you can also see, oh, hey, it looks like the client will take this to heart and can move forward from this and avoid those things that they can avoid and weather the things they can't.
I quite like the fact, and obviously I'm saying this as like, the living embodiment of Lisa Simpson. I quite like the fact that Geomancy will give you homework. So there's something that you can take away from it.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's something I'm especially interested in terms of pulling out like remediation. So not just saying like, oops, old towers sucks for you, or even like holding someone's hand and being like, this is going to be hard for you, but also being like, here's what you can do. You can do readings about what kind of magic, what kind of spirits, what kind of energy practices, as well as what kind of mundane things like diet, socializing, and study that you can do to like have a better time of things. And that really fascinates me because there you've got the intersection of like divination informing spirit work and spellcraft.
Yeah. So obviously it's, as I said earlier on, it wasn't something that I was hugely aware of when you compare it to something like tarot, which, you can't move in even the works now without finding, a tarot deck of some description.
Mhm.
And so why do you think it's a lot less well known now compared to how popular it was sort of obviously some time ago compared to all these other forms of divination that people have taken up?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's a victim of its own popularity from the 17th century onwards. I think this has at least two expressions I can kind of point at, which we can kind of attribute to economic and intellectual reasons. So on the one hand, it is such a simple system to pick up to start practicing. As I say, as I tried to show, there's also a lot of nuance to it, but you can pick it up pretty quick. And as a result, people want to. And so there is this mass of ever more streamlined publications being churned out from the 17th and certainly 18th and 19th centuries that seek to capitalize on its popularity. And these start to make it simpler and more basic and more lookup table and more yes, no across like the 18th and 19th century. So, this means that nuanced figures that might mean favorable or unfavorable things, depending on context and the question being asked, as we talked about, begin to be boiled down to these crude yes, no answers, right? Karka goes from that figure of like quarantine, but also potential imprisonment, goes from being like yes to questions of containment and focus and discipline, no to questions of like the journey will be delayed. You may have trouble with the law. And so what that means is like the market kind of drowns in all of these like bad geomancy books, for want of a better term, right? When people looked at it and tried to find out how to do it, they found a mass of like cheap handbooks and pamphlets that framed it in such a basic way that it became kind of unusable. And so that was a lot of people's experience of it. And so it started to fall out of favor. I'd also say there's a social dimension to this, which is that it remained popular as a folk practice in parlors and other places of people that are marginalized, right? Because the other side of this is that more ceremonial magics and mysticisms start to find the use of geomancy by more, let's just say, what it is, working class folks, a lot more suspect. Like it wasn't arcane enough, basically. So, say for instance, like the Golden Dawn, who also, rejected spiritualism and were not necessarily fans of folk magic, except when they could co-opt it into high Masonic ceremonialism. They kind of taught geomancy. You can find it on those syllabuses, but they generally frame it as just training wheels for more complicated, like, quote, proper stuff. And so I find there's something about how geomancy's emphasis on practical, grounded wisdom wasn't necessarily cool for ritual magicians looking for like complicated, Gnostic occultism. And so for that reason, it also fell out of favor during the big 19th century occult revival.
The Coast and Dawn always kind of strike me a little bit as being a bit like, I don't know, I guess we'll call them edgelords now, where it's like it's if is it sort of snobby enough for them? And you think, well, is the snobby stuff even useful? Is that actually helping anyone?
Right, right. Yeah, I'll do that like horrible backpedaling of like I have lots of friends who are in the Golden Dawn. Like as a training system, it can be great, and I have a lot of time for people that can engage with mysticism and keep their feet on the ground. Which again, most of these texts say like don't get lost in the clouds of this, right? Don't get lost in the vast Empyrean realms and not be able to pay your rent or like pay your friends back, right? But for me, I'm much more interested in the grassroots up stuff of living in this world, not as some like Gnostic torture or test, but as a set of things that we get to experience rather than have to.
Yeah. I suppose that when you were talking about the working class there, I was thinking this would probably be a really useful tool because you could learn the meanings from someone who told you them. And it doesn't
Mhm.
even really require literacy compared to some methods. I mean, obviously, I know there's other methods that don't require you to be able to physically read. But I suppose that would have also made it I'm thinking here, obviously, in terms of gender, the fact that when you look at a lot of texts, obviously being aimed at men because they were educated and could read them, and then you have the folk practices which can often be, passed on verbally or whatever. It
Yeah.
sort of feels like geomancy's got that nice kind of sitting in the middle where it's accessible to more people.
Yeah, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Yeah. Sometimes it gets talked about as like, oh, you need a lot of maths for it. And some of the techniques can get a little bit mathy, but in general, you can show someone how to do it with a whiteboard or a patch of dirt pretty quickly. You can do it with a stick and some dirt or with a fancy quill and parchment if you like. Um, if you can count up to four, you can add figures together and derive the other figures. If you know what an odd number and an even number are, you can go from there. Um, and yeah, it's certainly flexible in terms of the kind of tools that you need. versus what you can make work for you, which again for me is a big quality of folk magic, is like doing the most with the with what you have to hand, right? I've divined geomancy in bars and pubs by throwing 4 bottle caps, by
Ooh.
counting flying birds overhead, by using the long numbers printed on the bottom of train tickets. It's really incredibly versatile like that. And so, like, unsurprisingly, we absolutely see poor folks using it to answer, good old-fashioned everyday questions. Who stole my linens? Will the crops do well this year? Does he love me? Will my friend recover from this sickness? Where have my goats wandered off to? As well as like, how do I deal with this weird spirit?
Yeah. I think that's the thing that sort of strikes me, because I know obviously you've got a couple of classes on this, how it then appears in spellcraft as well. And you
Mhm.
forget, I suppose, how magically operative, I suppose, people might have been, or at least been open to the idea of other people being magically operative without
Mhm.
immediately going, oh, witch. And so I was wondering, how is geomancy more compatible with spellcraft and other forms of divination, or indeed, is it more compatible, or am I just completely getting the wrong end of the stick?
Well, again, I'm not here to like. I think you're right. I think it is very compatible. I'm not going to get into like diviners' wars of saying my divination system can beat up your divination system, but I have found it's very compatible for me, right? Partly this is because, as I said, the figures are elemental and planetary and slot very neatly into any works of that nature. So, for instance, like the 4 figures that, at least in the particular system I use, are attributed as fiery figures are Pua, the young warrior, that martial figure, Acquisitio, the Jupiterian figure of expansion, of gain, of taking more things on. Fortuna Major, the hard-won fortune, that like the dawning sun illuminating the work of the fields ahead of you. And Cauda Draconis, a figure which is attributed to both the malefic planets of Saturn and Mars, and often rules destruction. We can think of those, and I often do, as like different elements of doing fireworkings, right? Pur is the spark of enthusiasm that begins something. Acquisitio is the inflammable nature of fire that spreads. Fortuna Major is the hard work of the forge and the hearth and the oven to like concentrate heat to change things over a lasting period. Cauda is absolutely the destructive quality of fire and the ashes left behind. So you can do that kind of stuff with it. As I said, they're also very planetary, right? So the 2 figures attributed to Venus, Puella, the lady, the craftswoman, artisanship, Venus Invictus, and Amicio, loss, Venus after a heartbreak, as well as the loss of unburdening yourself of like emotional turmoil or melancholy or again like grief and shame. And so you can get at understanding the planets themselves and their influences and instantiations in the sublunary realm by looking at like how they can express themselves in various ways, right? I would also say geomancy is particularly good or has particularly heavy usage in talismanic glyphs, and that's because of the way the dotted forms of the figures, these 4 lines of single or double dots, are sigillized, right? In short, they do a join the dots to form these like simple glyphs, and it's old Uncle Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa who talks about geomantic characters or these sigils being betwixt images and characters. And what he means by that is that they're both pictographic, you can do image magic with them, but they're also ideographic. There's a sense in which they're just kind of like passwords of these parts of fate, right? And so you can see that in how there are mnemonics for learning the figures, the forms of the figures, but also that they can be sigillized by, again, joining their dots to form particular things. So Laetitia, which is a Jupiterian figure of like joy, delight, wonder, is its particular form of the 4 is like the first line is a single dot and then 2 dots, 2 dots, 2 dots. If you can kind of visualize that, it looks a little bit like an arch. And so it is sometimes said to be or to evoke a wedding arch. And Laetitia can mean weddings. Puella is another great example because the form of it, again, this is great for podcast and radio, right? Is a single dot, then 2 dots, then 1 dot, then 1 dot. And if you draw that out, it's not hard to also overlay or to join the dots to form a circle atop a cross. which is both the glyph of Venus itself and also often said to be like Venus's looking glass, right? And so these geomantic characters, these join the dot sigils of the forms of the figures, crop up in a lot of planetary talismans, especially those in like the veritable key and other kind of like Solomonic pentacles. And sometimes this is just by planetary function, right? Or by planetary alignment. So a pentacle of Jupiter contains an awful lot of Jupiterian geomantic characters. But what's interesting for me is where it's actually it's actually the function of the figure that is being used. There are a variety of planetary pentacles that utilize a mercurial figure, conjunctio, which is the crossroads, but is also called coming together. It's a 2-1-1-2. It's like an X shape. So it's X marks the spot. It's the crosshairs of targeting something. It's the bridging of things, figure of like liminality sometimes as well, and chimeras bringing things together. And so you find it on a lot of like wealth acquisition talismans, not because they're inherently mercurial, they might be Jupiterian or even solary, but because you are interested in the coming together of you and the wealth, right? And so how geomancy can be used in whether you're making talismans or marking the forms of the figures themselves is really, really fascinating to me. As I said, this can also be pulled out of readings, right? You can do a reading about what magic to do about a situation. And there are simple and more nuanced ways to do this, but it can boil down to like, okay, here's the lay of the land at the moment. Maybe you need more fire in your life, or maybe you need more Saturn to remediate where the shield says you're becoming unhelpfully unbalanced. And here's where a lot of like humoral theory, I think, can be really helpful. Humoral theory is not just a 4-part personality test, right? It's also mapping the flavor and the affectivity and the dynamism of balances in nature. Like places can have humors, situations, relationships can have humors as well as people. But in the way of understanding how figures can nudge things back to a useful dynamic balance, you can deliberately mark the figures, not unlike how you might pull a tarot card and put it on an altar to work that pattern of virtue in a spellcrafty way rather than a divining way. You can also mark the forms of the figures as muster points for spirits and energies to cohere and be directed. And in that sense, I think of the figures as kind of haunted doorways or like portals, if we want to frame it like that. They are like, yes, archives of befallen fate, but they're also crossroads that you can gather spirits that are into, emotional healing or art or gain or any number of other things that the figures are talking about.
It also strikes me, and this is probably just because of what I do for a living, but they kind of almost feel a little bit like logos in a way, the way that
Hmm.
like a logo stands in for everything that a brand is associated with,
Yeah,
both good
yeah,
and bad, but they're
yeah.
instantly recognizable. So I kind of
Hmm.
almost feel like there'd be an interesting way, I guess, for you to align with the ones that you felt you might maybe need more help with that particular thing.
Yeah, yeah, they're very broad umbrellas. I have found that there are like specific spirits that are like, I am a spirit of this figure, but I've also found a bunch of spirits who are like, I'm not bound by geomancy, but you're speaking a language that I understand. I am also a spirit that is interested in joy. And so you can absolutely mark that figure or its characters or sigils, and I'll turn up, you know? Yeah, so it's logos is not a bad way of framing it. These muster points, these nodes, these save points, as well as as well as a language that you can speak and frame like this is the work I am trying to do. These are the influences I would like to cohere and develop. These are the ones I'm trying to keep away from, right?
So, big question again. How did you come across it? Because again, because it's one of these things that may, I won't call it niche because obviously it's not, but I think because it's perhaps, less well known now than it possibly should be. So how did you come across it and what really like grabbed your attention and made you go, this is the thing that I really want to study and get to grips with?
I have been really it's partly like academic and partly from like practice and experimentation of stuff that I didn't just want to be history. I've been interested in the um, English Revolution for a long time. I'm like third generation socialist. And so I was very interested in the English Revolution of like how can we look at like working class resistance and things like that, as well as like just a topsy-turvy time that happens, before the French Revolution and stuff. So I got to study early modern England at uni, and I quickly kind of realized there was this component of the social and political and even environmental functions of magic and magical worlds and natural magic that was really key to all of this politics. And so I came across geomancy mostly through looking at the kinds of ways in which people were navigating a world turned upside down during 17th century like England with several civil wars, right? And so my master's degree was on like astrology and astrological magic at the time, looking at like how it was used as propaganda as well as how it was used to understand the natural world and also its social functions of medicine and things like that. And then my PhD, which was about early modern magical approaches to the passions, getting more interested in like emotion history from that social dimension, how we can, revolutionize our own hearts as well as like whoever happens to be sitting on a throne. And I was really lucky in that PhD to get to do it with the supervision from Professor Ronald Hutton down in Bristol. And I was maybe perhaps most struck in looking at all of this history with the popularity of geomancy amongst both like very much more middle class occult philosophers, but also working class folk healers and cunning folk at the time. And as I say, I was also like practicing a lot of this stuff out of these early modern handbooks, which in some cases are, a little of their time, shall we say. Um, but in some cases, like they still deal with like, fundamental questions of the human heart and head and life, right? And I found that throwing geomancy for myself and eventually casting it for friends and then acquaintances and then clients gave me the most grounded but also nuanced answers of any system I'd come across. Now, I think that arguably says as much, if not more, about me than it does about the system itself. But I've had many colleagues and now students who've also found the same.
So what you said there about class and whatnot and things, it's really interesting when you look at the state of play, shall we say, that we've got in the world now, most notably, I think, in the West, whether that's UK, US, probably lots of other places as well. And I think in the past where you would have had maybe this turn towards magic to try and solve huge problems that might otherwise kind of be a bit beyond you. Could you see that kind of thing happening again, or has everyone moved towards technology a little bit too much to solve everyone's problems?
Well, on the one hand, we can start to we could think about geomancy as itself a kind of occult technology, if we wanted to kind of attack the question there, which I don't. But like I know what you're saying. Like it's interesting because oh my goodness. If we want to get into the weeds of this, geomancy in the early modern period, this when I say it's like binary, it literally informs a lot of binary maths. Like you
Mhm.
can thread a line from people divining in the dirt to Leibniz, and a couple of other people to the ones and zeros of actual binary computer code. So that's kind of a like you never know what monsters your heroes are going to birth sometimes. Oh, history. How you resist my desire for you to just be good. I think there's capacity for divination and magic to still provide meaning and being in the world. Like the sorcery I try to practice isn't a retreat into these astral planes. It's further engagement with nature and the world and other people and spirits. And as a way of enriching that, I think that's incredibly powerful. I don't know if we need more technological developments. Yeah, I don't think we're dealing with a tech problem, right? We have enough food to feed everyone. The issue is the ideas that are governing how that gets allocated and hoarded. And so if we can do more to look at ways in which we can, from the ground up, understand ourselves as part of the world, not something that happens to it, or not just something that happens to it. And if we can understand ourselves and our relation with each other and hopefully attempt some way of living sustainably through all that, then I think it's worthwhile to think about how magic can be a helpful component in that.
Yeah. one of the things that fascinates me when you look at, when things get taken up, it's almost like, is there an app for it yet? And I
Mm.
feel like geomancy would lend itself to an app so easily.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of them. It's
Are there?
something that yeah, it's something that newcomers to it get very excited about, is building their own apps that can set a chart, set a shield chart for you. Yeah, there's a bunch of them. I think they can be great. I'm also a little bit of a fuddy-duddy in terms of like absolutely on the fly. This is super useful, great, gets you a chart very quickly that you can analyze. But I also think learning how to set the chart is
Mm.
also an important part of doing the thing. But ideally both, right? I will microwave meals. Like I'm not above that. I'm not better than that. But also I don't want to just eat microwavable meals. I want to like learn how to cook, and learn what else I can do with these ingredients.
Yeah, I know when I first had a go at geomancy, I did that thing where I'd added something together wrong. And you know how there's
And the
a
chart will tell you, right?
yeah. And I got to the end and I was like, oh, hang on, I've got one of the figures it can't be is the last one. I've gone
Mm-hmm.
horribly wrong somewhere.
Yep.
Where have I done
Yep.
this?
Yep. The chart has its own checks and balances, right? Because of the maths of adding up figures of like this figure has like a first dot, its first line is a dot, and the second figure it's added to has two dots. Again, this is way easier with a blackboard, right? That means it's three dots, which means it's odd, which means it produces the next figure of a single dot on its line. And because you're adding odds and evens down four lines, eventually, owing to the inherent maths of this, which you don't need to have any kind of maths degree in, it's just what it will do. It will always produce a judge figure, a final answer, an executive summary of the rest of the chart in that 15th place, which will have an even number of dots. And so if you have an odd number of dots, you know you've added something up wrong. So there are these inherent checks and balances within casting a chart, like you said, exactly, that again means that like that's not a barrier to you have to know this much maths, you have to have this much literacy. It's actually a shortcut around that stuff.
Yeah, and it was so funny the way I did mine because honestly, again with what I do for a job, I sort of I had the outline of a shield chart in Photoshop and I was just using like the brush tool to do the
Hmm.
dots.
Awesome. Love
Um,
it.
but I was still having to add them together, so I was obviously still working it out. And then, as I say, I got part in. I'm like, oh no! And then I was like, oh, hang on, I can just delete that one and then put the
Yep.
right one in. So it was
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
quite useful from that point of view. But I
Hmm.
like the fact that there was something in there to just kind of go, no, 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 you've actually done that wrong. So it's
Yeah,
quite
yeah.
nice being told off by my own tool.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like criticism is not necessarily rejection, right? The first step of being good at something is kind of sucking at something. And that gets to be a thing you learn from, as much as you learn more from doing things wrong than you do from doing them right sometimes, right? And the fact that, yeah, like you said, the tool itself will be like, are you sure you mean that? Is really helpful, is really helpful.
Yeah, and obviously I double check everything now, so clearly I've remembered that and gone, nope, that's not right. Um,
Internalize the lesson, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is the thing, because humans have that thing where would rather be right than happy. I think it, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Gosh. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, without getting too bitchy, like that's something I think those of us who are drawn or need the medicine of spirits and magic in our lives, um yeah, also it's important to realize when we are holding on to trying to be right about grand cosmic truths, and when we are trying to actually use those to be happy
Yeah.
and live hopefully like fulfilling lives, right? And support our friends and loved ones in theirs.
Yeah, so I suppose this is where you want to think about what's your end goal for using the thing.
Yeah.
And that leads me on to my next question. I've sort of touched on it a little bit before, but could you actually see a specific geomancy revival at any point? Because obviously lots of different divinatory tools sort of pop
Mm.
up and become popular and so on, although it does tend to be the aesthetically pleasing ones that look good on the gram.
Mm.
And obviously, let's be honest, shield charts, and I will put one on the screen for YouTube purposes, like they're
Mm.
not necessarily like the most wowzers sort of thing to look at visually if you're obviously on a platform like Instagram. Do you
Yeah.
think that there would be a revival at any point, or do you think it's one of those things where the people who need to be drawn to it are?
I would love to see a revival. I think I think it has value, has medicine, if I can get that pompous, for lots of people on lots of levels, right? Um, I certainly think we're seeing more folks practicing geomancy nowadays than when I started a couple of decades ago. I'm still youthful. There's a bunch of like really useful stuff online, you know. My friend and fellow geomancer Sam Block still has his digital Ambler blog up, I think, and that's a wealth of freely available geomantic writing and analysis, especially. I would agree with you. Like a shield chart doesn't necessarily look super arcane, especially when I'm scribbling it in my client book. But I think you can still get a little bit aesthetic with geomantic divination and magic. I can shout out my friend and colleague Austin Fuller over on Banex Bramble, for instance, who has been producing some really beautiful like calligraphy along with his
Oh,
in
nice.
his shield blanks. There are many artists who've engaged with like especially like some like modernist artists. I forget his name. Bunch of like Brazilian stuff playing with like the geometric art of the figures in some really cool and interesting ways. There's color theory you can get into and a bunch of stuff like that. In terms of like a wider sense of like revival, not just as like a popularity, but as more people coming to it. I also see in a lot of like the dedicated online groups discussing geomancy, a lot of conversations being sparked between practitioners of like European geomancy and practitioners of Arabic and Persianate forms of it. Like these people are still around, right? Which is awesome. And in many ways, like Grammel is far more developed and sophisticated than like some many of the European forms. There's also increasing conversations happening with and between diviners from traditional and diasporic African traditions beginning to happen as well. Because just as Arabic Ramal found its way into informing European geomancy, it also influenced and lent the forms of its figures to West African systems of divination and corpuses of like oral wisdom. So like Ifa, for instance, and by extension, like Dilogun in Lukumi Orisha practice. Now, it's really worth pointing out that these systems work very differently in many ways to like European geomancy. Chiefly, like Ifa is not just a magical divination system, like casting a chart for yourself about something, but it's a highly formalized priestly way of communicating with Orisha, with divine facets of nature for advice and guidance in developing and maintaining good character in one's best life. And don't go asking vast facets of the divine for casual answers unless you're willing to listen and be a part of that culture and practice, right? So while like the Odu of Ifa and the Lagoon aren't the same as the geomantic figures for all sorts of like technical, cultural, and religious reasons, there are historical links between these geomantic arts and sciences. And I think it's terribly exciting to be able to talk to these priests and diviners about, if only about like best practices and ethics and like client care, like at the very least, the cultures of divination and so on. And to plug my own podcast is one of the things one of the many things I'm really grateful for in doing Radio Free Golgotha with my very dear friend Jesse Hathaway Diaz, who is, among many other things, a crown priest in Lukumi and a keen student of Odu, which is that we get to talk about comparisons and contrasts between West African and African diasporic Odu and Odu Meji and geomantic figures. So these kinds of conversations that are happening, like cross-culturally, are also, I think, really exciting, really important, and also maybe are a piece of this revival that we might indeed be seeing. Time will tell.
I quite like the fact that it's expanding it out more than just sort of looking inward towards whatever Europe is doing, but kind of looking outwards, but like not in that horrible appropriative way, but in more of kind of like a colleagues sort of way.
Yeah, yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
Obviously, you teach classes on geomancy, and feel free to plug them. Have you seen more people actually taking it up? Like, are they particularly popular among the ones that you offer, or do people sort of tend more towards the I want to work with spirits kind of work?
Well, the main way I consult for clients is geomancy. I will occasionally still throw cards, like playing card stuff, and even tarot, especially for like clients who are, writers or artists or creative sorts who are interested in exploring options. But geomancy is my main means of providing the divination I do, and also like the spell work I do is always preceded by reading. Like we need to look at what's going on and what I can do about it and what you can do about it. And so I do have people that come to me for particular work that end up being like, hey, this geomancy stuff seems pretty cool. That I then can direct to a bunch of the classes I do. It's certainly the goal for me to get more people practicing. I think the more people we have exploring it, the more perspectives we have, the more experiences we can bring, and the richer things get to be. I think there is plenty of geomancy to go around. And that's why I've been kind of evangelizing for it for so long. Have you heard the ground news? Um, and I'm amazed at the ways my students put this into practice. I have a student who is specifically working on geomancy by working with crows and like counting the crows that turn up and when they call and when they don't and things like that. I've got other students and clients who are doing their own translation projects, who are looking at like older Latin works of geomancy, as well as who are, from places where their family practiced a form of rammel and are interested in like going back over some of these texts outside of the European corpus. I got a bunch of students who've hung their shingle as professional geomancers themselves and have like incorporated that into, energy healing practices and things like that. I also just try and emphasize that I think learning geomancy can help you in your everyday world and life. It doesn't mean you have to become a professional wizard or something necessarily. And again, the aspects where geomancy fits very neatly with like humoral theory and practice do give us advice about like how to engage with other people, with those ways of like self-regulation, of like emotional intelligence or that kind of thing. So yeah, I do get to see a bunch of people not just like taking classes or clapping at the end politely, but actually like folding it into and out of their lives, which is incredible, like absolutely incredible. That's one of the perks of getting to do this for sure.
I will say I do quite like the idea of a bunch of people then being like, I want to be a professional wizard.
Yeah, I mean, go for it, right? Yeah, it is as glamorous and as unglamorous as you think it'll be.
I think this is the thing that I remember I've talked to Tabitha Stanmore about Cunning Folk, and she's going to be on in June when I do the witches and Cunning Folk.
Oh,
Yeah,
brilliant. Tabitha's great. Her new book is so good, Cunning Folk.
yeah, isn't
Um,
it awesome?
yeah, it's fantastic. She's so cool.
But we're going on about the term service magician, and I'm like, oh, I want to see that more often on LinkedIn. Never mind
Hmm.
all these highbrow marketing executive assistant manager type titles. No, I want to see more service magicians. I just think the
Hell yeah.
world would be better with more people with that kind of job title.
Hell yeah. I have an ongoing conversation with a very, very dear friend of mine who's a conjure doctor, does Southern Conjure, Professor Charles Porterfield, one of the best living cartomancers out there. Yes, I said that, Charles. Uh, who he and I regularly talk about like, we kind of want to be like taken as plumbers. Like, yes, there are vast occult, arcane questions to answer, but we just work here, man. And like, to treat a service magician as like, with respect, but like as a plumber, as like, yep, you got ghosts in these walls. Okay, here's what we're gonna do about it. We're gonna like this. This is an easy fix. This is a more complicated fix. Oh boy, you've had some cowboys in here. Like it's a joke, but it's also not. Like treating this as a grounded thing, as like a craft to develop and to apply in tangible ways to help people is I think really crucial. And it's a way that folk magic isn't just a set of, that horrible word, quaint, right? Isn't just a set of cultural practices, although that's in itself very human and important, but it's also a set of examples of how we can, again, be more engaged in the world and be more engaged in community and in supporting each other. And so having that sense of like, I just work here, man, and like here's the limits of what my spirits have said in divination that we can do, and here's what you can do about this. And yeah, let's get these ghosts, if not out of your walls, then at least paying some kind of rent.
Oh, that is a property development program I would 100% watch.
I got friends and family in New Orleans where they point out that like it's more common for a property to advertise that it is not haunted. Um,
Oh, class. I must admit, I always wonder that whenever I watch these like house hunting programs, you
mm,
watch them walk into like a house that looks really oppressive, although it might just be because the decor's not been changed since 1972. And you do think, why is nobody's first question been, so is it haunted? Because that's
right.
100% what I would ask first.
And what kind of ghosts? Are they cool? What are the neighbors like? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because if you get a ghost that's gonna like look after the house while you're out, that is useful.
For sure. Yeah, yeah. It's not about imposing. Oh, there we go. There's the ecological dimension, right? It's not just imposing our human civilization of bland science and tabula rasa on things. It's not about colonizing our own dead. It's about like how can we work together here, people? And are you stuck because you're unhappy because you haven't resolved something? Are you here because you just really love this place and you want to see people thrive here? Or how can we work together on this? And that also means having good boundaries. Like, I will not be kept up. I've got work tomorrow. Like, you can go whale, between the hours of 4 and 6 on Sunday. But like, be a good roommate, please.
Yeah, and I think that's what it comes back to what you said about sort of community. And I think that's something that humans have gotten really bad at lately is
Mm.
living alongside other people, whether they're alive or dead, and
Yeah.
basically just not being a big silly about it, for want of a better word. Not the word I'd usually use, but I don't really swear on the podcast, so that is everything.
I
Um,
apologize if any F-bombs have slipped out while I've
no, I
been
don't. I think
enthusing.
you've been okay. Um,
For
so,
the kids.
I mean, you could have got a bit sweary about the Golden Dawn, but I think that was fine. So, last question, what is it that you're working on right now? Because you're always working on the most interesting stuff. And how can people find you online?
In terms of stuff that's just come out, I got a new book out with my friend and colleague Brian Johnson, which is the Black Raven, which is a study of the folk necromancy of early modern Germany. It's a wonderful little grimoire about treasure hunting with devils and also helping stuck ghosts to move on. So really excited and really grateful for Hadean Press for putting that out. So I'll be chatting about that a bit more and encouraging people to dive into some of these like Faustian folk conjurations. I'm mostly working to continue to develop my rather tongue-in-cheek titled Secret Library of a Patreon, where I post a lot of current research and experiments and art and articles on folk magic, grimoires, spirit work, service magic, and things like that. In terms of the geomancy I'm putting out on there, particularly, I'm currently working on about over halfway, nearly coming up 3/4 of the way through, detailed delineations of those 192 placements of the 16 figures across the
Ooh.
12 houses. Um, it's thousands and thousands of words on how you can actually apply these answers that you find in your charts, along with like geomantic book reviews and how-tos and things like that. I'm seeing clients for those geomantic consults as well as like magical coaching. Folks can book that from my site if they like. I'll be teaching a new online course series on spellcrafts from a range of the more goetic grimoires, especially the Grimorium Verum, which is a favorite of mine, and that's starting mid-June. That's going to be like a live course. I'm speaking at a couple of conferences and festivals coming up. I'll be at the Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival on and talking about cunning crafts of resistance, and I'm also talking about geomancy at Temple Fest, as well as doing a folk necromancy power hour with Jesse. And you can find all the information about that on the Radio Free Golgotha site, or if folks want to sign up to my Friends of English Magic mailing list, I'd be super grateful for that. And yeah, I have a host of like recorded classes on geomancy and other things over on my site as well. I'd be really delighted if folks wanted to check some of those out.
Yeah, I can highly recommend the classes because obviously I've actually consumed it. Consumed is the wrong word. Sorry, that came out of my mouth and immediately I was like, I need to
No, gobble them up. That's great. No, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so it's been absolutely fabulous speaking to you, and I hope everything goes well. I must admit, the Black Raven does look gorgeous because I got the email about it from the publisher the other day, and I was like, oh, that is a nice looking book.
Yeah, they knocked it out of the park. Yeah, and Dali, who did the art, is yeah, really really pleased with it.
Yeah,
And Brian's translations are amazing. It's a work that I don't think has been put into English before, and he's done some really great historical analysis of like ghost lore and stuff like that. And it's a grimoire that has a lot of stuff about do your usual. It isn't a thing that's like you can only consecrate a circle or your candles this way. It kind of assumes you already know what you're doing, or at least you have access to other things. And so it feels like very much a grimoire that can slot into people's extant practices. And it was also an opportunity, therefore, to look at like wider stuff in the kind of grubby Faustian German necromancies and stuff like that about working with unclean spirits to survey like what are your options for like this milieu of texts that talk about that do offer examples of like how to cast a circle or work with a spirit sigil or dig treasure up.
I just really hope that people go out and find lots of treasure.
Likewise, yeah. And if they want to, remember the people that wrote the book that helped them find that, then I would be very grateful for that too. Not gonna lie,
Well, yeah, you should have like a finder's fee.
That seems fair, right? That seems reasonable.
Yeah, I think
I got to
that'd be
keep my
cool.
cats in cat toys and things.
All cats will have their trinkets. It's been absolutely fabulous talking to you, though. I'm glad you came on, actually.
Oh, likewise. Thanks so much for having me.
My absolute pleasure. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.